If you didn't watch my quick start guide for the Canon R6 Mark II, I highly recommend you watch that before watching this video. Alright, so I'm in A+ mode here on the Canon R6 Mark II, as you can see here. So it gives you a little description, Scene Intelligent Auto. Basically what the camera's going to do is it's going to analyze the scene and it's going to try to optimize the settings for what it thinks you're shooting. That includes moving subjects, portraits, landscapes, and so forth. So if you're new to the camera, A+ full auto is a really good way to go. You know, as you learn more, you can get more into the advanced modes. But basically in this mode, when you point, it's just going to automatically focus. You can see the focus coming up. All I'm doing is pressing the shutter down here, and it's focusing on that quarter because it's the closest thing to the camera to focus on. Now if I zoom out to 24mm here, now you can see the whole lab scene, and it's still focusing on right around where the quarter is, which is what you would expect it to do. Now what's cool is you can also just touch around the screen and it'll focus on that. Also, if I hit this info button, it'll bring up more information, as you can see here. But anyways, over here on the left, you have a couple of settings that you can change. For example, this one right here will allow you to change your single shooting into continuous shooting, for example, or self-timer. So that's what that option is, and you can do that in auto mode, which is quite nice. So auto is actually giving you some power. In addition to that, this button here on the bottom left is touch to shutter, or touch shutter is what it's called. So if I just touch the screen, it's going to focus and take the shot wherever I tell it to. So that's pretty much how that works. Now to turn touch shutter off, you could just hit that button there, and now you can see it has like a little off there. And also touch focus is still enabled. You could see it in the center of the screen. It's a little bit hard to see when looking at the lab scene here, but you can see that green box. And notice up here there's a little off button. That's how you would turn off the touch focus. So if I just hit that, now the touch focus / tracking is turned off and it's back to default mode. So that's pretty much mostly what you can do here in auto mode. There's not that many features. If I hit the Q button here, that'll bring you in, and that will show you some of the other features you can change. So it's telling you here, choose from the presets, and then shoot. I'm just going to click that little checkbox so I don't see this next time. And I'm going to click OK. And now, if you want, you can scroll through here and change some of the camera settings like background, blur, brightness, for example. Full auto mode is actually pretty powerful considering these changes that it allows you to do, which is quite nice. So when in doubt, throw the camera in full auto if you don't know how to set the camera, and most likely it'll do a really good job for you. It's very intelligent. All right, so the next mode I wanted to go over was this hybrid auto option. Now this is an interesting feature here, and you can see if I hit this little arrow, it basically just records a little bit of video, like 2 to 3 seconds, every time you take a photo. So it gives you like this live view sort of capture, and then it'll combine it into like a little movie for you. The next one I want to go over is scene mode here. Now, special scene. This is a really great mode for people that are newer to cameras and stuff because it gives you a little bit more control over the auto mode. So for example, auto mode is going to choose what it thinks you're shooting at. Scene mode allows you to pick. So over here on the left, you can see how I have all these different modes. You got portrait, you have group photo. So a lot of people ask me all the time, I'm taking a picture of a group. How do I get everyone in focus? Well, you got to know how to use the camera settings for that. You got to raise the aperture basically to get a larger depth of field. But in this mode, you can just select group and the camera will do it for you. Same thing with landscapes. You have this really cool panorama mode. Super fun to use the panorama mode. Highly recommend playing around with that. And then of course you have sports shooting. You have kids, which is just fantastic. So it's going to put all the tracking stuff to high speed. Then you have this cool panning mode, which will allow you to, the camera will slow the shutter speed down for you and allow you to get really cool panning shots, as you can see here with that background blur. Then we have close-ups for macro photography and stuff like that. Food photography. So this doesn't have a built-in flash. So I wouldn't use this mode unless you have a flash, obviously. Then you have handheld night scene. Now this is really cool because it basically takes multiple exposures, sort of like an HDR, and then combines them together, and it'll give you extra detail, but more importantly, it'll keep things sharp and as little noise as possible. So this mode is really for that, like to just keep that noise super low and also get you good dynamic range. Then we have this one here, which is HDR backlit. So this will also take multiple exposures and combine them, but this is more of a high dynamic range scene situation as opposed to dark shooting at night. And then again, silent shutter. So if you're at church or something, you're in a scenario at a wedding, whatever the case may be, and you need the shutter to be silent and you don't know where that is in the menu, you could just put the camera in scene mode, go to silent shutter, and you're good to go. And now while you're in scene mode, you do have quite a few features here. If I hit the Q button, you can see there's a bunch of different options, so you can change a few things, such as your focus area, your drive mode, quality, your AF mode and stuff. So you do get more power in scene mode compared to full auto mode. Just wanted to make you aware of that as well. I'm just going to get it off silent shutter and put it back to like portrait or something for now. And you can see what scene you're in up there on the top left. See the little picture of the portrait face? Now another cool mode we have here is creative filters. So this is just kind of like used almost Photoshop effects sort of thing when you're using this mode. So notice here, just like scene mode, you have all these different options on the left hand side. So HDR, all sorts of cool stuff. You got miniature effect, toy camera, fisheye, water painting, soft focus. The soft focus one's really cool. And grainy black and white. So that's pretty much how the creative filters work. Now program auto, like it says right here, the shutter speed and the aperture are set automatically. And this is kind of similar to full auto mode, but it gives you way more power to change a lot of other settings. For example, if I go in the Q menu here, now you can see all the different settings I have in the Q menu. So that's why program auto is more powerful than full auto. And again, you can see here, you can turn the dials to change the exposure comp. And this dial here on the back is changing the ISO. So cameras today, pretty much all cameras, have 3 tools built in to help you manipulate exposure. So we have what's called aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, or ISO. So think of aperture like a lens pupil. The larger it is, the more light that can come through. The smaller it is, the less light that can come through over a period of time. Now, aperture is measured in f-stops, and the lower the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. Now in an actual lens, this is called the aperture diaphragm. And as you can see here on my 7 Artisans 35mm f/0.95 lens, the aperture diaphragm is gigantic when it's fully open at f/0.95. But when I turn this fully manual lens aperture diaphragm, you could see how that lens pupil or aperture diaphragm is closing down. Now, if you can just humor me for a second, if you were to imagine water flowing through the hole of the aperture diaphragm, you can imagine that if it's wide open, the water is going to flow through really quickly. It'll take less time to get like X amount of water. Like if I was pouring a gallon of water through, it would go much faster if the aperture was wide open. Now, if you've stopped that aperture down, you have a tiny hole, it's going to take longer for that water to get through. And light works the same way. So when it comes to shutter speed, how you need to think about that is time. So there's a mechanism in front of the sensor that goes up and down and basically exposes the sensor for a certain amount of time. Now, if you want a freeze action, you're going to want a really fast shutter speed so there's no motion blur. If you want motion blur, you're going to have a slower shutter speed, and that will allow movement to be captured on the sensor. Now, shutter speed is also measured in f-stops, but it's represented as like fractions if it's a really fast shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second, and then it goes all the way to like full seconds if you want slow shutter speeds, like all the way up to 30 seconds, for example. And then there's bulb mode on top of that where you can get really long exposures. All right, so the last side of the exposure triangle is ISO. Now, ISO you need to think about as the gain of the sensor or the sensor sensitivity. So if you can imagine a stereo with nothing playing and you just crank the volume up, you know that noise you hear, that's like the gain. And that's kind of how a sensor works, similarly. So the higher you have the ISO, the more gain that is applied to the sensor, so you're going to get a little bit more digital noise. However, it will allow you to capture light faster, similar to how the aperture works, the larger aperture. The more sensitive sensor will just grab the light faster. It's like a sponge that like is more activated type thing. So that's how it works, but at the cost of noise. So in general, you're going going to want to have the ISO as low as possible to have the cleanest images or cleanest video as possible. But like I said, depending on your shutter speed and depending on the lighting conditions in your scene, you might have to raise up the ISO. And, you know, it's important that you know what's going on because it's all connected. So the next mode we're going to go over is shutter priority mode. And that's the one that says TV. This will allow you to manipulate the shutter speed. For example, you could see here, there's the shutter speed and here's the ISO. So I'm just going to put the ISO at 100 for now for this demonstration. All right, so now the ISO is at 100. So you can see here, because the aperture is blinking, the scene is underexposed. So I'm going to need to slow down the shutter speed a little bit, like so. All right, so there we have it. So now when you slow the shutter speed down, the camera is pretty much going to automatically adjust the aperture. So as I slow that shutter speed down, the camera is trying to maintain a proper exposure with the ISO at 100. So watch what happens when we take a photo here. Let me just spin this. Now you can see in the auto review here, if I go into the playback menu, you see how that captured the motion. That's because I had the shutter speed really slow. I had it at, 0.4 of a second right there. That motion blur was captured because of that slower shutter speed. Now if I raise the shutter speed up to a faster shutter speed, like let's put it at 1/400th of a second. Now we're going to have to raise the ISO here because you could see the screen is super underexposed. So let's raise up the ISO here. Right about there. All right, so we're at ISO 1000 f4.5 and 1/400th of a second. So now, let's spin this. So you see how that spinning fan is now frozen? That's because I had a fast shutter speed. So shutter speed controls time. So I was able to get a much faster shutter speed, which froze the action. So if you're shooting sports, you're going to want a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. So shutter priority mode gives you the ability to change the shutter speed. The camera will select the aperture for you, and you can either set the ISO to auto if you want, or you can dial that in. So great mode for freezing action and also getting blurry water and stuff like that. All right, guys, so the next mode we're going to go over is aperture. So aperture will allow you to control the aperture size inside the lens. So the aperture diaphragm in the lens is pretty much very similar to the pupil of your eye. It changes in size as you change the aperture. So what that smaller aperture does is it allows for a larger depth of field, and it also allows for less light to come in, or you could say it takes longer for the light to come in. And it's just a really good tool for getting those blurry backgrounds, for example. If you want the blurry backgrounds, you're going to want to have the aperture as fast as possible, meaning the lower the number, the better. So as you can see here at f4, let me zoom in here on the quarter. Focus on that quarter right there. I'm just raising the exposure comp a little bit so you can see the bokeh balls in the background. I am overexposed though, you could see right here. But check this out. So watch what happens when I change the aperture. It's at f4. So watch what happens. You see how the balls are changing size? That's the depth of field changing. So at f16, you can see the background is more sharp, let's say, because the bokeh balls are smaller. And if I open it up, now you can see the bokeh balls are as large as they can be because I'm at the maximum aperture for this particular lens, which is f4. So those larger bokeh balls are simulating a more blurry background. That's what I'm trying to illustrate here. So let me just put the exposure comp back to 0. But notice here at f4, you can see how the dollar bill is blurry as well. That's how shallow the depth of field is. So the quarter is sharp. The quarter is only a couple of inches away. It's like maybe 5 inches away from the dollar bill. So now if I focus on the dollar bill, you can see the quarter is blurry. So you see that? Here, let me take a photo. And let me take a photo of the quarter as well so I could show you what that looks like. All right, so I'll just compare those two. Now, for example, if I'm taking a portrait photo, I would, using this particular lens, which is the Canon 24-105, I would have it set to f4, and I would try to go to at least 85 millimeter to like 105 millimeter. I particularly like the way that looks. And if you pose your subject with the background a decent distance away, it'll be nice and blurry, and you'll get that 3D pop, which looks awesome, as you can see here. Now, if you're taking a landscape photo, you're going to want most likely the more sharpness throughout the scene. And if that's the case, what you would need to do is dial the aperture down to like f11, somewhere around f9, 10, 11. You can go a little higher if you want, but it will tend to soften just a little bit as you get up to like f16 and so forth. But if you take a photo like this, you can see I'm focused on the quarter. You can see how the dollar bill is pretty much effectively sharp now because I increased the depth of field. So that's pretty much how that works when using aperture priority mode. So let's go into manual mode next here. And this will allow me to control everything independently. And what's so cool is there's a dial associated with each option. So you could see up here on the top of the camera, that's controlling shutter speed. So let's put that at 1/60th of a second. This back dial here is now controlling aperture. So you can see I'm dialing in the aperture, like so. And then this dial here, the thumb dial, is controlling the ISO. And that's what we're looking at. And in the center here, the exposure comp like slider is now a meter. So that's actually showing you your exposure metering. So again, if I change the shutter speed and press the shutter down, you could see how the meter is now at +2 because I'm way overexposed. So I basically have to speed up the shutter in order to allow less time for the light to get in, and now the exposure looks correct, as you could see here in the center. So that's the proper exposure for this particular scene. Now, if I want a faster shutter speed, for example, let's say I go 1/320 of a second. That's the shutter speed that I'm thinking that I'm going to require for whatever I'm trying to shoot. You can see now the image is way underexposed. So I can open up the aperture a little bit, but it doesn't open anymore. It only goes to f4. So I'm still way underexposed. So now my only option is to use the ISO. So now I could raise the ISO up to get the exposure back to correct, you see? So you can see here how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all work together. Now, just a quick tip here though, when you're doing slower shutter speeds, highly recommend going into the Q menu, going into the drive mode area, and setting the self timer to like 2 seconds, like so. And watch this. Now when I take the photo, so I touch the camera, let go of the camera, that gives the camera a second to stop shaking, and that's how you get really slow shutters that are tack sharp. Flexible priority auto exposure. Now this is a really cool mode because it allows you to pretty much, if I just hit that, it'll give you a little bit more information. So it'll allow you to set the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO if you want, basically turning the camera into full manual. Or you could use just one option if you want to just change the aperture, just change the shutter speed. Let me show you. It's a little easier to show you. So you can see here on the bottom, you have different options selected. Now, if I turn this dial here, that's going to change the exposure compensation, as you can see right here in the center. And that little symbol on the left represents this dial. So if I turn that, you can see the exposure compensation turning. That's what that's doing. Now the top dial, the one up here, is going to be the aperture. So notice how I'm changing the aperture now. So basically how the camera is set is aperture priority mode right now, using this flexible. I would personally rather just use aperture priority or shutter priority or manual mode though myself, but this is a good in-between situation if you're just trying to get more advanced with the camera but you're not quite ready for manual mode. All right, so the next mode I wanted to show you guys is bulb mode. Now, bulb mode is great for stuff like fireworks, star trails, and things like that, as you can see from the photo. So when you press the shutter down and go to take a photo, I have to hold the shutter down with my finger. And the longer you hold the shutter, the longer the exposure is going to be. See how it's counting there? And then when you let go of the shutter, that's your exposure. So bulb mode is a really advanced mode, and you might be wondering, like, why the heck would I use that? Well, if you're doing really long exposures that take like a minute long, like at midnight, for example, and you're taking a photo of the ocean and you want that smoky looking water, you would want to use bulb mode. If you're doing fireworks, you can do a trick where you cover the lens and make it nice and dark, and then you just reveal it every once in a while to expose for the firework, and then you cover the lens again. And so you can have like a 1-minute exposure, but you're mostly blocking the lens, so no light's coming in. And then every once in a while you unblock the lens and allow that firework explosion, to come into the scene. And that's how you get those really advanced exposures. And bulb mode you kind of need for that. Now the downside is you have to use a remote control, so you're not touching the camera when using bulb mode. That's unfortunate, but it just is what it is. So you either need to use the app to control the camera, which I have not used yet, so I can't say for sure that that will work in bulb mode, but I believe it will. Or Canon sells a remote that plugs into the side, and then you'd be able to do it with the remote. Then you don't have to worry about touching the camera or holding your finger on it for bulb mode. All right, guys, so the last thing I want to show you is the custom modes. Now we have custom 1, custom 2, and custom 3. Now, how those work is you pretty much have to have the camera in whatever mode you want to use first. So for example, if I'm in manual mode, all right, so let's just say I want to have the camera set like this for some reason because I like using these settings. So what I can do is if I go into the menu and I go into the gear icon and I scroll over to page 6, right here, see this? Custom C1 to C3. If you go in there and you go register settings, all right, register, click OK. Now it's waiting, and there you have it. So now, if I switch the camera, let's go to manual mode here, actually, and I'm just going to change the settings all around. So now that's what it looks like in manual mode. So it's underexposed, the settings are all messed up, kind of. Now watch what happens when I put it into C1. See how it brought the settings right back to where I had it? And it doesn't just remember these settings, it remembers like pretty much everything. Like all of these settings will be saved to your custom. So this is super powerful because you have 3 custom modes for both photo and video. So you can switch the camera to video mode and also have 3 separate custom settings. So for photography wise, you could have one set up for sports shooting, one set up for portraits, one set up for landscapes or something like that. So in video mode, you can also use manual mode, aperture priority mode, TV mode, program auto mode, as you can see on the top left. So in video mode, it works pretty much the same way as photography mode. So you are limited in some of the features, of course, because you're recording video, but you could see how the exposure and everything works exactly the same when in manual mode. So, all right, guys, so that about wraps up my Canon R6 Mark II camera modes video. I really hope you got something out of this video, and if you found it useful, if you can give me a thumbs up, I would really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing as well. Links below the video, and I really hope you guys have a great day. Take care.